Hello, I'm Epic Treatise. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're returning to Tom
I'm an historian.
Rowsell, whose channel name, Survive the Jive, definitely isn't a racist dog whistle. Last time we pointed out that his claimed historical credentials mean that if he makes basic mistakes in historical facts or interpretation, we can only assume he's deliberately lying to his audience. We left off with Rowsell failing to debunk the idea of black Romans in Britain. Let's see what we get on to now. I'm sorry, this song is an absolute bop. I've had it in my head for like 3 days.
One of the lines says, "Before Harold lost at Hastings, black people played their part." What does that mean?
Rowsell just pretending he doesn't understand basic idiomatic English here.
So far in the song, they have not succeeded in coming up with a single black person. In fact, there probably were a few black people in Roman Britain and maybe some after as well, but very rare, like the Ethiopian soldier that Septimus Severus saw, for example. If that story is true, then there's a black soldier. There might have been black soldiers. We haven't actually found any yet. We haven't actually found any.
So you admit there were black Romans in Britain. So what the hell has the last 3 minutes of this video been about? What was the whole point of the last section? Was it just to deny that Septimius Severus was black? Why does that matter if you're then going to grant that there actually were black Romans in Britain? Tom, your arguments make no sense.
Many of the skeletons that have previously been called ancient Black Britain, such as Ivory Bangle Lady and Beachy Head Lady, have subsequently, after DNA analysis, been proved not only not to really be black, but not to have any black ancestry at all.
So that is true for Beachy Head Lady. She was initially posited to be of African extraction by a lady to whom the museum in Eastbourne turned to for facial reconstruction of the skeleton. That later turned out to be false, following a more thorough archaeological study. However, that isn't true of Ivory Bangle Lady. She was believed, and is still believed, to be of mixed African and Northern European ancestry, based on what's called a four-disc analysis, which associated the osteology with two 19th century African American reference populations, suggesting some sub-Saharan African ancestry. Although a DNA study is planned for her remains, they've not been published, nor, as far as I can ascertain, have they even taken place. He's lumping the two women together here to generalise one mistake onto both bodies. That's what we call a lie. Rowsell now goes off on an extended rant about the BBC, and I genuinely don't care, so I'm going to skip it. He doesn't say anything new, it's just him crying about the BBC saying things he doesn't like.
Okay, so let's skip forward 1500 years to the Tudor period, which is the next verse.
Sardonic tone here, I suppose, is to suggest, again, there weren't any Africans in Britain in the intervening time. This is just such a pointless and silly complaint. It's like listening to a kid's song about the planets going around the sun and complaining that it hasn't explained the mathematics of special relativity. Just in case he actually wants us to take this complaint seriously, yes, there were Africans in Britain between the end of the Roman Empire and Henry VIII. Just to list a few, the so-called Hadrian the African was an influential bishop and close friend of the Archbishop of Canterbury in Bede's day, that's the late 7th century. We also have Saxon period burials of two North African and one sub-Saharan African woman from Bambara. Then we have a set of 9 African individuals excavated from the 12th, 13th century monastery graveyard in Ipswich, most famously Ipswich Man. So yeah, there were Africans in Britain between Septimius Severus and Henry, which Rowsell either knows or he's carefully avoided looking for so he can maintain his false view of British history. Either way, he's being dishonest.
And here they claim that John Blank, who was the trumpeter of Henry VIII, was black. And actually, they got this one right. He really was a black guy. Spain, as I mentioned, the Muslims controlled it.
What? What? The Muslims controlled Spain? The Reconquista liberated the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula before 1250, 250 years before Henry came to the throne. There was a strip of land in the south, the Emirate of Granada, which wasn't completely conquered until 1492, when Henry was one. But by the time Henry came to the throne, Spain was 100% ruled by the Catholics. The actual contention is that John Blank came to England with Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was, and this may surprise you, not a Muslim. This is spectacularly basic information that I would expect every undergraduate historian to know, and if they didn't know it, I would expect them to be able to find out, given 30 seconds and access to Google. There is absolutely no reason for Rowsell to get this wrong. Why is he lying about this?
And they had an African slave trade, and some of their slaves were granted freedom if they converted to Islam, and as a result, some black people who had formerly been slaves could become free. And then you had a population of a few black people within the Moorish population.
Well, that's all very fascinating, Rowsell, but of what relevance is it to a man coming from Aragon, an area that hadn't been controlled by the Muslims for over 300 years?
During, Tudor times, there were some people who were black who were referred to as Moors, but DNA analysis of a Moorish cemetery.
Okay, so this is where Rowsell's lying becomes really blatant. So he's put up on the screen a figure, I assume from a genetics report from what he describes as a Moorish cemetery. Just a brief perusal of this figure reveals that what this actually is an Iberian cemetery. That is a Spanish cemetery, in use from the 3rd to the 16th centuries. That is from 400 years before the Islamic conquest of Iberia, right up to at least a century, but more likely 3 centuries, after it was returned to Christian hands. Note that Rowsell makes no attempt to give a reference for this figure, or even name the location of the burials, and I cannot for the life of me discover where it came from. Even reverse image searching the figure reveals nothing. He really doesn't want anyone to be able to look this up. But I am 99% sure this is a real genetics report from a real cemetery, and I'll explain why in a bit.
Reveals that there were more white Moors than black Moors. In fact, they didn't find a single black Moor in the cemetery. There were just a couple with some African ancestry, sub-Saharan African ancestry, so they might have been classed as black. But the original Moors were North African, which means like Middle Eastern, basically.
No, North African doesn't mean basically Middle Eastern. We went into this in the last video. We're going to go into it a bit more in a minute, but I don't want to retread this ground now.
And they enslaved white people and black people, and some of those whites and blacks converted to Islam and became free and were then called Moors. So being a Moor in that period could mean you were either black, Middle Eastern, or white, but more likely you were Middle Eastern. The blacks and the whites were a minority of the Moors.
Okay, so now we can get into why I'm so sure that this is a real figure from a real genetics report. Let me bring it up so that we can all look at it together. It's a little hard to decipher removed from the explanation, presumably offered in the report, but what it appears to be showing is a list of individuals buried in an Iberian graveyard between the 3rd and 16th centuries. Down the left, it divides those burials into 3 distinct periods, presumably of site use, and then gives an incomplete list of Y chromosome haplotypes with a greater or lesser degree of specificity. On the right, it gives a list of mitochondrial haplotypes, generally in the vaguest terms. I assume all of this would have been gone into in far greater detail in the text. What's interesting for us is that the haplotypes of these individuals have been given percentage of genetic origins. These include sub-Saharan African types in 2 cases and Levantine types in most cases. Now, Rowsell doesn't expect his audience to know this, but the Levant is the archaeologist term for the northern part of the Middle East, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Iran, Iraq, etc. So, when Rowsell is trying to say that these people were all basically Middle Eastern, well, yeah, there is a small minority of their DNA which has origins in the Middle East, but that's not where the vast majority of it is coming from. As you can see, a lot of the genetic material is coming from North African haplotypes, but a lot more is local Iberian material. Do you see what we don't get any of in the section of the graph he supplied us with? You got it. We don't see any Central or Northern European genetic material. So when he says there were more white Moors than there were black Moors, what he means is that in an Iberian cemetery, there was more Iberian genetic material than sub-Saharan African. The evidence that disproves his point is literally on the screen next to him. So there's two possibilities. The most likely, as I see it, is that he's simply lying. He's assuming his audience won't actually look at the so-called evidence he's put up in front of them, and he can just lie while looking like he's actually providing supporting evidence. That is, I think, the most likely answer. The other possibility is that he's ignoring the Iberian context, assuming that an Iberian cemetery is representative of North Africa, and then counting Iberian people as white. Now, this is still lying, because any historian,
I'm an historian,
knows you can't take evidence from one continent and then generalize your results to a different continent. However, he could be counting all the European peoples as white. The problem here is that he has been very insistent on using the traditional definition of black to mean specifically sub-Saharan African. If we're going to insist on using traditional ethnic definitions, Hispanic people are not white. I have been called a gringo because Hispanic people do not consider themselves white. In Europe, they tend to consider themselves simply Hispanic or Mediterranean, if they're being more general. And white people do not generally consider Hispanic people to be white. Check out American politics if you want evidence of that. So, why am I sure that this graph is a real report? Because it directly disproves what Rowsell is claiming.
And at no point does Moor just mean a black people. So just because someone is called a Moor, that doesn't mean they're black. In fact, there were, in the cemetery where the DNA analysis of Moorish skeletons happened, there were more white Moors than black Moors. But you wouldn't assume that Moor means white person, because that's wrong. It's just because of their slavery.
You can't explain all of the genetic diversity in a 3rd to 16th century Iberian cemetery with reference to the Islamic slave trade. That doesn't make any sense. And he must know that it doesn't make any sense. He's just lying. Why is this guy so obsessed with the Islamic slave trade?
Now, John Blank was probably descended from one of these freed slaves.
Why is that probably true? We know absolutely nothing about his life before he came to England. The Portuguese slave trade had been in motion for over 60 years when Blank came to England. It's much more likely that he was transferred to Aragon from Portugal than from the Islamic slave trade. Why, when Rowsell is so obsessed with the Islamic slave trade, does he make no mention at all of the Portuguese slave trade? Well, I think I know, but I'll allow my audience to decide.
And he ended up in England. Why? Because the court of Henry VIII needed to demonstrate, the king needed to demonstrate his worldliness, his power. And having an exotic man from the far reaches of the earth with such an unusual complexion that would shock everybody and cause everyone in the court to gossip and talk about what an impressive sort of menagerie of exotic things and people and animals this king of England has.
John Blank was not part of a menagerie. Black people were not zoo animals. Blank was a servant to the crown, that is, an employee of this king. An employee, indeed, who we know got a promotion and a pay rise at some point. Your pet tiger does not petition you for a raise, and it doesn't get promoted to head of tiger services. It's really gross to describe a human being in terms of being an animal in a menagerie. And yes, I know humans are animals in the biological sense, but not in the normal social use of the term. Something makes me think that Rowsell would not describe Henry's white servants as part of a menagerie.
The next claim they make is also from roughly the same period, and it concerns a woman also born in Spain. And she was called Catalina of Motril, and she was not black. She was probably of Moorish descent, and therefore she might be of mixed North African and Spanish descent. We don't have her DNA. Nobody called her black. She certainly doesn't. There's no reason to think she was black. It's completely arbitrary to call her black, to make up that she was sub-Saharan African. And as I say, based on scientific evidence of Moorish cemeteries in Spain, it would be much more statistically likely that she was white than she was black, or that she was Middle Eastern, which would be most obvious because Moors are Middle Eastern.
So I actually didn't know about Catalina before I listened to this song. She's a pretty obscure character. We can guess from her name that she was born in Montreal in the Emirate of Granada, and assume she was enslaved during the Castilian reconquest in 1492. We know about her from only 3 sources. During Henry's attempt to divorce Catherine, the Spanish contingent attempted to solicit information from a Catalina who had been Catherine's slave. She had apparently since married a Spanish crossbow maker and returned to Spain to raise a family. It's presumed she was one of the 2 slaves which were recorded as part of Catherine's entourage when she arrived in England. We also know that these slaves were described by the writer Thomas More as pygmy Ethiopians. The wording is slightly uncomfortable to a modern ear, but it was a fairly standard way of referring to sub-Saharan Africans in the 16th century. Rowsell isn't going to mention any of this, of course, information that it was trivially easy to discover. He rather would like us to believe that the Granadan slave brought to England by Catherine, described as an Ethiopian by More, was a white woman. And he asserts this on the basis that a cemetery in Iberia had mostly Iberian genetic material in it. Ladies and gentlemen, he is a liar who thinks his audience are stupid. And this is where his commentary on the song ends. He's going to leave a couple of verses out of his discussion. I'm not going to speculate as to why, but I will point out that they mention the black soldiers who volunteered to fight for Britain in the 2 world wars. I'll allow my audience to decide why Rowsell didn't want black soldiers serving our country to be part of his narrative. Anyway, I can't stand any more of this guy's pontifications, and the rest of the video descends into a political rant about Britain needing a sense of continuity. I have no intention of giving that sort of guff oxygen. Ultimately, though, I can't sum this video up any better than by using Rowsell's own words.
This ultimately is a criminal misrepresentation of British history.
I've been Epic Treatise. Please do drop me a like and a comment below, or a dislike and a hate comment below if you really didn't like it. We encourage debate on this channel. I hope you've all enjoyed it though. Till next time, goodbye.